Very much the home of Madiba, is the oldest African liberation movement on the continent, and it celebrated its 100th anniversary on the 8th of January 2012, if you'll remember that. Now, this historic event has generated significant public debate within both the ANC and South African society at large. The book, 100 Years of ANC, directed at a wide readership with an interest in understanding the historical roots of South Africa's current politics, will find this volume informative. And between you and I, the author has been asked to put a second volume, but that's our little secret. We'll chat to her in just a moment. It's one of the contributors of the book documenting the history of the ANC. We continue our discussion now with Prof Booysen from Witwatersrand School of Management. You and I were talking about some of the research, and you let slip that perhaps a second volume is coming up, but I won't delve too deeply in that. I know it's probably something that's happening behind the scenes, but let's talk a bit more about your work as far as research is concerned. We spoke about the current research that you were doing and the findings thereof, but let's take it back to perhaps 1991 when you started your research and you looked into relationships within the ANC, with the ANC and society, ANC and PAC. Oh, yeah. Very delicate relationships there. Tell us a bit about that.
Yes, that was fascinating part. You know, it was always the ANC and the PAC, the two main liberation movements. And it was always contentious as to what is the standing between the two, also given the historical split between the two way back. And the ANC was never quite sure. They thought they had won the international war, international support for the struggle and for the armed struggle. They knew they were the leading force in the armed struggle, but never sure exactly where the PAC would come out. And then our research in the early 1990s first confirmed that the ANC is the recognized liberation movement. In that research of the early 90s, the PAC came up around 8% of the vote, whereas in that poll, and things were still taking shape, the ANC came around somewhere in the mid-50s. Not nearly what the eventual election result was much better. The PAC, 8% then, totally declined when it came to elections. And there was a very effective, powerful election campaign that really consolidated the sense of liberation in South Africa. And that election campaign also obviously managed to turn around those strange little political parties, Bantustan parties, tricameral parties that we had in South Africa in apartheid days. And in those attempts by the nationalist regime to transform apartheid tricameral parties, and just a few of those parties, like Minority Front, like Botswana's UCDP and IFP, a much bigger one. But only a few of those strange earlier parties made it into electoral politics and actually managed to survive. And it was this whole conversion process that was taking shape. And we were also monitoring these conversion processes. And the bulk of those parties, the people there, decided to associate with the ANC. And it's very interesting too, in this very recent research a few months ago that we did, one could see some of those sentiments still coming through. People talking that they were not always ANC, they were in these other parties. But that Nelson Mandela's presence, the magic of Mandela, had helped turning them around and starting to believe in the ANC. And that really brought home that the ANC was not just the external liberation movement, was not just the people in prison, but so many of the people on the ground, ordinary people that were not always with the ANC.
Young people during that time, I find, and perhaps it's a bit of a generalization or a stereotype, but it seemed as if the young people were more involved in politics and more interested during that time, during that climate, and that perhaps today not so much. You know, taking a look at your research back then and today, are you finding a difference in the mentality of young South Africans?
I certainly think so. You know, youth are always slightly less focused on politics because they've got to come to terms with how to make a life, how to qualify themselves, etc. But those times they had everything to win. They had the sense that they were on the threshold of bigger possibilities, and an equal time of doors opening for them that people before them didn't have, and people after them also had, but maybe not to that sudden floodgates open extent. So there was a great sense of excitement, and there was all this internal mobilization, UDM, MDM in South Africa internally through the 1980s into the 1990s, and youth were hugely involved in that. So they were seeing this as very much part of the fruit of their struggle as well.
And what did Dr. Nelson Mandela make of all these findings and research, statistics, etc.? What did he make of that?
I think he sort of almost instantaneously absorbed it and made it part of his new post-apartheid, we're moving into elections character. He was not always didn't always have the time. He was meeting international leaders and traveling. He wasn't always in the research briefings that we did, for example, but he was always briefed by other people in the audience. He had these special people there who would go and talk to him and took research documents over to him in his office, whatever time of the day. He always wanted to be fully briefed on what was going on. And obviously, the new game was elections. He was intrigued to know what the parties, and I think he used the term Mickey Mouse parties first in those days. He was very intrigued as to what they were up to. He was ready to take the ANC into elections and into democratic government. Of course, and playing that dual game expertly, dual game of government of national unity, you conciliatory to the opposition parties, but the ANC has to have the serious upper hand. So it was conciliation, but elections is a different game. You exploit the weaknesses of your opposition.
And I mean, you just mentioned that it was all new for them.
Yes.
The leadership role, elections, presidency, all of that was a foreign concept. They had just come out of prison, so he must have been very eager and keen on getting some of that information that perhaps would put him above his opponents. And how did he go about fishing that kind of information from people?
It was foreign in a certain way, in that the ANC had not previously had the opportunity to participate in democratic elections, but it was so ingrained in his consciousness. This is part of the ideal. This is how the vehicle to the liberation of my people, the confirmation that we shall now rule in this country. And that was his frame of mind, absorbing and working with elections information.
We'll have to leave it there for now, because you and I can carry on all day talking about the times there just after he was freed from prison, the early elections, and to the research that you've done now. I know that research coming out next week, so perhaps we'll have to call you and talk to us a little bit more about that. But we'll have to leave it there for now. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Susan Booysen, Wits University professor, there with some of the findings of research she had done from way back in the early 19s, up to date, and one of those culminating in a book as well that she had written not too long ago. But we'll have all that detail for you a little bit later. Let's